right, we're going to start to get underway here, and what we're going to be talking about here in this particular seminar is with a specific focus to what happened last week.
We can walk around.
With the January WASDE report, and many people look at the January WASDE report and say, one of the most important of the year. And I think I'll let the guys kind of outline that and get a better sense of it.
The big surprise on corn is not only did they increase the harvested acres from what we expected, but they also increased the yield on the corn, which really caught us by surprise. So I think the market was looking, I feel, at a very, very strong number, which we got. So I think we're just going to have to see how all thing turns out from there. But to me, to increase the yield as much as they did really took me by surprise, because we went from 172.5 to 173.3. So what does that mean going forward? I will elaborate that later on, but I just want to give you a heads up about how the corn did affect the market, because they did give us a bigger corn crop than what we expected.
Anyhow, the crop report was a shocker. It usually is. As you know, that the January report, quite often the markets either limit up or limit down following it. We go into it saying, oh, it's not, we don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be bland. And then we get some kind of a surprise. Same thing happened this year. We came into this report basically looking for increase in production, increase in year-end projected stocks, boring, and bearish. The market was expecting a bearish report, and shockingly, it got a bullish report. I was going to say very bullish, but I've got an offset to that. And the reason why, David mentioned that the yield went up on corn, which was a little bit of a surprise, not a shocker. The market expected the yield and production to go up. But the real shocker was they cut corn acres back, harvested corn acres back by 1.6 million.
Yeah.
And where did that come from? Because that was a big surprise. And because of the fewer, even though we had an increased yield and they did pull back demand, we still dropped the year-ending stocks projection, which was a big shock. That was the shocker, because nobody expected the year-end stocks to decline. And it happened because of that huge reduction in acres. Where did it come from? It's because of the drought that occurred in the central Midwest, Nebraska in particular, right. Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota,
right.
Parts of Iowa, a little bit of Iowa.
Western Iowa, yes.
Yeah, a little bit of that. And as you all know, that's where the market drive this past year came from. It was the drought conditions there. We had excellent weather here. In fact, Indiana ended up with a yield on corn, an average yield of 190, which is fantastic. Not as good as the year before, but in the eastern U.S., we had good weather, good crops, and of course in the central Midwest, we had drought conditions, in particular Nebraska.
One of the things, before we go on, is USDA claims that some of that loss that we're talking about was unharvested acres in those drought-stricken areas.
Right, unharvested acres because of the drought conditions.
These areas here.
Well, we didn't see that coming, and so the net result is that we dropped the stocks for corn down to 1.24 billion. And I want to point out that essentially, for all practical purposes, at 1.2 billion, you're out of corn. That's pipeline supplies. And so, therefore, with a 1.24 billion projected carryover, we have no room for error. Therefore, the market responded sharply to the upside, and because it was taken completely by surprise. And because of that lack of air, if we have any air whatsoever, additional air in South America, all those things in South America are mostly going very well. We have problems in Argentina, as you pointed out, but Brazil's doing super. And if we have any kind of problems with spring planting, this market's going to go through the roof. But these are all buts and ifs, of course. But that was the shocker. That was the main thrust of the market, was that loss of acres and the reduction in the projected carryover,
Correct.
which was totally unexpected.
Correct.
Now, soybeans?
Let's go back to South America. Paraguay and Uruguay, which are right in between Argentina and Brazil, planted much more acres because of Argentina, and they're looking very, very good at this point, yes.
And David, and just on that note real quickly, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves with regard to South America, but there is a guy here in the United States who's one of the leading experts on South America. His name is Dr. Michael Cordonnier. And one of the things that he has pointed out is that, when we think about some of the weather troubles that we've got in South America, we have a tendency maybe to think, okay, well, yeah, that's going to keep our prices bolstered. But he said, let's not forget, to the point you just made, they planted a lot more acres this past year, a lot more. So they are in a position to actually lose some from weather and still have a crop that beats out last year.
Yeah, I've known Cordonnier since 1978. He comes from, now it's Russia, Ohio, okay? It's not Russia. It's spelled Russia, but it's pronounced Russia. It's right outside of Versailles. And his brother still lives there, and he taught ag econ at the high school there in Bradford and Gettysburg, Ohio. So I know him, and I followed this guy ever since. And every winter, he goes down to South America, checks the crops. In the summer, he comes back here. And I tell you, talk about boots on the ground. Cordonnier does it, yes.
So based on what we're talking about here in terms of the numbers, David, go back to corn for just a second and talk about prices, where we're at, because we've talked a lot about on the program,
right.
We have a tendency to talk about, okay, well, what does this mean for prices?
Right.
And as John just pointed out, we're very tight. We're almost at a point where we're theoretically out.
Yes.
So the question has always been at this time of year, based on these numbers, are we in a position, we'll talk a little bit more about South America momentarily, that might sustain roughly a $15 soybean price and a $6.75, $6.80 price for corn?
Yeah, because I'm definitely looking at $15, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But I'm almost $7 on the corn at this point. And the one thing John has taught me is the corn-soybean ratio, and I just calculated it yesterday on the close for new crop, okay? Because this is where the rubber really meets the road. The corn-soybean ratio, John, was 2.32. So it was below 2.1. Now the beans have come back a little bit, but if it goes above 2.4, there's more incentive to plant more beans. If it goes below 2.2 to 2.1, then it's more incentive to plant corn. So if you want to know what the market's telling you, what to plant, always calculate the corn and soybean ratio. All you have to do is divide the soybean price by the corn price for the new crop, and you'll get it. So remember, 2.4 is the benchmark.
And John,
2.4 to 2.5, that's kind of, it's going to vary in one part of the country versus the other, of course, but it's somewhere in that area. There's no one number where it's break even, but it's.
So, John, what's it telling us right now?
We need more corn acres. I mean, that's the bottom line, Rob, right there, which was going to point out is that the report, what it primarily told us is that we need to buy more corn acres for this spring. Because we just, although I've got a little bit of an offset to that coming up a little bit later.
Let me explain something real quick. Look at the harvested area on corn. I know we cut it for silage. I know that about 7% of the corn's cut for silage. But look at the bean acres harvested, 86.3. All right? What if we have a harvested acres on corn of 82 to 84? That brings us up to 16 to 17 billion on a corn crop. So that's something definitely to keep in mind. We need more corn acres because we need more corn. Now, switching over to soybeans, John, the surprises were also in the soybeans. If you'll notice, the production was much less than expected. Harvested area was cut. The yield, big deal there.
300,000 acres were cut on harvested area.
And John, they cut it below 50. Now, that's the benchmark on the bean yield. When you're talking about 50 or better, big crop. If you're talking about anything less than 50, the market pays a huge attention to it. So here we go. We go from a 50.2 on the last. They look for 50.3. They want an increase on the yield. And look what we got, 49.5, a big attention getter on the beans. No wonder they were up 25 or 24 cents.
And down a couple of bushels from last year. And once again, the dry conditions in the central Midwest are primarily accounted for that. Indiana, by the way, had a 57.5 yield, which is an excellent yield for Indiana, of course. However, not as good as the previous year when we hit 60. But the bottom line is, again, back to the next page, on the soybeans, the government also reduced the projected year-end carryover on the soybeans from that which was expected, and from that number that they published back in December, they took it down to 210. Now that number is it's tight. It's not as relatively tight as the corn, but the number where you're basically out of soybeans is around 120 to 140 million, and the projected carryover is at 210. So once again, there's very little room for error. But it's not in nearly as much danger as the corn. And I might point out, we keep jumping to South America, but Brazil is on its way to producing a gigantic soybean crop, which is going to certainly give us a cushion. So once again, the market focuses on corn, and to get more corn acres, that's going to keep the price buoyed. It's going to keep it relatively high. But there's more than one way to skin a cat, and we've already talked about it, is you can accomplish the job not through the price itself, but through the ratio. And the number that's going to get you a lot more corn acres versus soybeans is when you get that ratio down to about 2.2, 2.1, somewhere in there. Now, the 2.4 to 2.5 is your break-even number, but you got to get it down to really get the switch that we need. You really need to get it down to around 2.2 or lower. So watch that. See, there's more than one way to do this job, but nevertheless, the bottom line results is still basically bullish for prices for corn and soybeans.
All right. We really kind of need to move on to make sure that we cover a lot of stuff here. David, I'm going to move to the South American crop production slide, talk a little bit more about that. Because, and the reason why we keep bringing up South America is because obviously they're our number one competitor on the global stage, and that will have an impact on what's going on with prices here in the U.S. And one of the things is that China is obviously one of the big elephants in the room, and there have been some recent trade deals between China and Brazil, so that's something we're paying attention to very carefully.
All right, real quickly here, Argentina is where the problems are in South America. As David mentioned earlier, Argentina is in the midst of drought conditions, probably the worst drought in 60 years in Argentina, and that is really cutting back the projections for corn and soybeans in Argentina. And also, too, the drop dead deadline for planting in Argentina is around January the 15th, right now. And they're not completely planted. Because of the dry conditions, they're only about, at least a week ago, they were only around 82% planted on the soybeans.
I've been hearing 17% is missing in Argentina.
Right. And on corn, it's a little bit less than that is the percentage.
8, I
and
think.
So some of these acres are not going to get planted, but assuming they all get planted, you can see very quickly that Argentine corn is down from where the projections were back in December. And the same thing is true of the soybeans. And actually, those numbers are probably too high.
Yes.
The Rosario Exchange in Argentina has got projections that are sharply below what the USDA had. Most people think USDA is probably high on those projections at the moment. And that remains to be seen.
Wasn't it 36 on corn? And was it 42 on the beans?
Yeah, 36 on corn or 42 on soybeans, and you can see that's quite a bit of ways away from the USDA
Look at that
numbers.
difference. How can they compensate for that? But it's because of the inability to plant, and now they're running out of time because their weather just won't allow it.
So Rosario is already assuming that some acres are not going to get planted. Although in South America they don't talk about acres, they talk about hectares. So we have to continually flop those back and forth. Now, Brazil. Brazil's off to a terrific start. You can see the numbers on Brazil are fantastic. And I'd like to point out, look at that Brazil corn production at 125 million tons, and look at what it was last year at 116 million. So you can see there's a huge increase in corn production in Brazil. And that's become a major factor in the marketplace anymore because Brazil is now the second largest exporter of corn in the world. And there was a time not that long ago, go back 10, 12 years ago, Brazil was a net importer of corn. They were not an exporter, but they have increased their production so much they're now a huge competitor for corn exports with the U.S. We always talk about it with soybeans, but no, now they're also a big factor in corn.
There are a couple of other things that we always have to factor in with South America. One of them is, for some weird reason, they don't have as much grain storage as we do, nor do they have the technology to keep that grain in condition. So, David, we've talked about that in a number of different times. Not only that, but then the impact of the strength and weakness, whatever it is this week, of the U.S. dollar.
Correct.
And I'm talking about those are some factors that really impact what's going on between Brazil and China, as an example.
Yeah, recently the dollar was 112. It was way up over the other currencies. It's down to 102 right now. So that favors our exports because that means people buying our crops pay less. Their currency gets more value from them, yes.
Look at that soybean production in Brazil, 153 million tons projected, and compare that with a year ago, which was 129.5. They increased their acres, but their yield is up also. Last year they had a weather stress crop. Their yields production was down sharply, so that's not a fair comparison. However, that is, if you convert that into an increase in bushels, it's about an increase versus a year ago of 860 million bushels. Gulp. So I think you can see very clearly that if the conditions in Brazil stay good, they are going to have one huge soybean crop to export, and it's going to give us a lot of competition.
Yes.
Well, and on the beans, just real quickly, because there's a couple of other dynamics, and one of them is Argentina. In terms of soybeans, they don't ship whole soybeans.
Right.
Number one. Number two, our soybeans continue to be of a higher quality.
Yes, that's correct. Yes. They're the largest shipper in the world of meal and soybean oil. They ship more meal and soybean oil than we do. So they have a huge advantage. But right, their bean quality isn't as good as ours. That's true. Their seeds aren't as good. So
I'm sorry, I hate to do this to you, Rob, but actually soybean quality in South America is better overall.
Is that one of those things that changed?
Because of the higher oil content.
okay, because I noticed we're not getting as much protein in the bean meal too, so it's the higher oil
Right,
content.
it's they have they get more oil in the bean than we do in the U.S. and that increases the value of their beans versus ours. At equal money, at equal price, their beans are probably worth 10 to 15 cents a bushel more than ours. That changes from year to year depending upon the oil content.
Yes.
And nobody can tell me exactly why. That's been the case for years. I don't know why their oil content's higher, but it is. And it may have to do with just the fact of the soil conditions and the weather conditions there. The hotter the weather, the greater the oil content is in the soybeans.
Right.
And their
protein.
beans are more comparable to the quality of beans, or the seeds that they plant for beans in South America is more comparable to that in the southern U.S., like Mississippi and through there. And for whatever reason, their beans are worth more because of the higher oil.
So let's look at something else too. December the 1st, stocks. Now, the economists look at this very, very closely because they want to know about the implied feed usage of corn because, we know how much ethanol is made. We know how much we use for industrial use. We know everything we can about corn except for feed usage. How would you know how much corn was fed? You'd have to go to every farm that has any type of animal there that they're feeding and try and gauge how many bushels. You can't. So what you do is you take all the numbers you know and minus that to the total stocks, and that's your feed usage. On corn, the stocks last year were 11,642,000,000. The guess was 11,153,000,000, but look what it came out with. Not only is the corn crop smaller, but the stocks of corn on December 1st were lower, 10,809,000,000. Now check this out. On the soybeans, they were 3,152 a year ago. 3,132 was the guess. 3,022. Given that we've got a smaller crop of soybeans, we also corroborate it with a smaller crop of stocks as of December the 1st. So if you would please flip to the next one. Thank you. So when we look at the stocks, one thing that grain people that look very closely is how much is on farm and how much is off farm. If you'll notice on corn, it's December the 1st, we did see a drop off farm of 6.7% from a year ago. Off farm, which is already sold, it's in the bins for the grain merchants and others, it's down 7.8. Now, if you look at the states, Iowa's up 1.6, but down on the off farm. Somebody in Iowa is going to push for corn. They better, they're not going to get it. Also, on Illinois, their on-farm stocks are up 4.8, and their off-farm stocks are up 6.8. So what does that tell me? If you need corn, if you don't have as much, you better push for it, because you're going to need that corn, because everybody else got more than what they expected. Now, in all these other states, look at Indiana first, 6.6 down, but off farm's only down 1.1. So people here in Indiana moved a lot of corn, and now look at Nebraska with a smaller crop. They moved a ton of corn, and the drop on the on-farm stocks. Wait till you see nature heats a vacuum. A lot of corn's going to have to end up in Nebraska, I feel. Now, can you switch to beans and let John do that?
What when it's going to end up in Nebraska? Of course it is.
Oh.
Because they lost a huge portion of their crop.
Of course.
It is kind of interesting.
Duh.
What do they have a lot of in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, of course?
Jackrabbits,
They have a lot of that.
tumbleweeds.
Cotton.
Cattle feedlots.
Cattle feed. Oh,
Cattle
my
feedlots.
goodness. Oh, my word. You can hear them move for miles. Right.
Yeah, and it's just this affects basis. It doesn't affect the flat price. But it's kind of interesting that they've got, because of the drought, that Kansas, Nebraska, down into Texas and Oklahoma, et cetera, they've had a huge reduction in their local corn, and they have, of course, all the cattle they still have to feed along with the hogs and the other animals.
Yes.
And to kind of boil that down, and in the eastern U.S., as you well know, had excellent crops. The bottom line is that you're going to, if you take the loss of production there, versus the number of animals there, the demand for corn for feed use, there are going to have to be an additional somewhere around 500 unit trains of corn that are going to have to come out of the eastern U.S. to move into that part of the country to make up for that deficit.
Yeah, John, but something happened for the cattle. Do you want to know a secret? Nobody's talking about it. I had it on WOWO. How many heard my cattle comment on WOWO? Hey, they listen, don't they? No, I'm kidding. I'm teasing. Okay. The story is that when COVID hit, the feedlots got slammed because the packers had to shut down because their employees were getting COVID, and they had to shut down completely. So what happened was the feedlots were stuck with cattle that were maturing that the packers did not want. So they couldn't put the new feeders in. They couldn't take the fats out. So what happened was a huge backlog. The cash market fell for cattle, just plummeted, but the beef price went to the moon. Packers made more money on beef than they've ever made before, ever. So now what's happened? Because the feeders weren't placed into the feedlot at that time, because the heavies moved out, they were sold eventually, but they didn't have the feeders to put them in because nobody wanted them at that point, so they got rid of them. So the point is, there's a shortage of cattle coming, okay? A big shortage of cattle coming, all right? So if you have a freezer and you don't have much beef in it, consider getting some beef. Pork, we were supposed to see this huge increase of hogs coming because of a backlog in December. No, the hogs haven't shown up here in January either. So where are these animals? So yeah, feed use is very, very important, but you better know your livestock market when you talk about, and you don't. He doesn't know anything about the livestock market, do you? You know a cow moves and a pig.
I have a degree in animal science. I know about the livestock market. David.
David, there's one other. David, there's one other piece here, and that was the bird flu. Tell us about the impact of that on feed as well, because we're talking about 47 million egg layers died because of the bird flu just this past year.
Now, we've seen this somewhat here. Ohio's had some. We haven't had that much in Indiana, thank goodness. The same thing happened the last time, but it's worse this time than it was before. And we're seeing it in Iowa. We're seeing in Nebraska, we're seeing in all these big egg states out there, and they don't have the eggs. I heard that it was in Iowa last week, $7.20 a dozen for a dozen eggs. $7.20 a dozen.
Now, if you ever thought that it was something other than transportation
Right.
that drives prices up for food.
Right.
Okay, we got a lot of eggs right here in our area. They don't have to go very far to
Nope.
get to Kroger. Okay, that's why we're paying $2.99 and they're paying $7.
So I saw a picture on Twitter. It's really cute. This guy was giving his girlfriend for Valentine's Day something very rare and very expensive. He had a carton of eggs and he had the top open and says, "Here, honey, here's something very rare and very expensive. Happy Valentine's Day."
Ha ha.
Well, you laughed at least. He's the hardest one to make laugh, anyway.
He's in the doghouse.
Uh-oh. Now, do you want to talk about the soybeans and talk about on-farm and off-farm, since that's your bailiwick?
No, I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about on-farm versus off-farm and the soybeans.
Well, corn was good enough. Especially, well, let's look at Indiana. I'll do that real quick.
You do it real quick if you want to,
I
but
want
remember
to.
that this affects basis. It doesn't affect the flat price.
Okay, let's go here.
Well, I guess basis is part of the flat price, so I kind of take that back.
Okay, Indiana, up 3.1 on farm. You stored soybeans. Thank you. And you're looking at off farm 2.7. So it's fairly well balanced here. But wait, until these guys get crushing soybeans, you're going to have some better basis bids, okay? What's the largest biofuel production area in the United States? Where is that? Where? Who said here? Where? Claypool, yes. So they want soybeans, okay? You're going to see them, I think, consistently bid there. Illinois, down both ways. Hey, they want soybean. Look at Iowa. Woof, they really want it. And look at Minnesota, all right? So next slide, please, Rob.
Yeah, just a quick thing
Okay.
about winter wheat. The numbers on that were for the most part pretty bearish because they increased stocks on wheat, and also the winter wheat acres, I believe the numbers versus a year ago up almost 3 million acres.
Yes.
Yeah, so so some of the high prices of wheat are bringing more acres, and not here, but in the rest of the world. So the numbers on wheat, generally speaking, were bearish.
And the prospective plantings on spring wheat are way, way, way up because they had the terrible, terrible weather.
And David,
Okay.
just 10 seconds or less, the weather globally affecting wheat?
Yeah, Australia had some really wet weather, but the crop was good, 42 million metric tons. You've got India, whammo, 112 million metric tons.
Yeah,
I didn't
didn't
know.
that shock you?
Yeah, I know.
We just got that news last week about the wheat in India, and it was like, when you think of wheat, I mean, anybody think of India?
They have to
No.
grow a lot because the rats consume the majority of it there because they don't do any animal control.
And
Also,
how about Ukraine?
oh, Ukraine is terrible. They were targeting tractors and combines in the field last fall that were harvesting in summer. So, yeah, they've had a terrible time, and their planting is way, way behind on
So I
their
think
winter
one of the
wheat.
bottom lines is there are a lot of moving parts
Yes.
still when it comes to wheat
Yes.
on a global basis.
Ending stocks of particular interest. You're seeing corn, like John said before, at 1.242. You're seeing the soybeans at 2.1. Hello.
210.
That number.
Not 2.1, 210.
I'm sorry, 210. And thank you. And on the wheat, 356. I don't mind being wrong. I just hate to admit it. And 571 was what we saw in December. So, hey, everything's plus, plus, plus going ahead here. So, Rob, do the deed here. Now, look at these numbers because they're really interesting for the one factor that although the production dropped, and I said this on WOWO recently, I don't care about the supply, I care about demand. Because if you're going to change anything that makes the price go down, you lose demand for it. And look how much we lost demand-wise. John, elaborate.
Yeah, I'll have to admit, I kind of got caught asleep a little bit because I was looking through these numbers, and I was really kind of astounded at how much demand has gone down in the past year for corn. And if you look at total demand for corn, it's over 1 billion bushels. About a 17% decline in demand. And I'll have to admit that I did not realize the demand had been hurt that badly. And of course, where was that demand? What did hurt it? There's a lot of factors involved. Number one is just high price. Obviously, we've been looking at corn at some extraordinarily high prices, and that's going to affect demand. But we took feed demand down. You can see the numbers right there. They're down, the feed demand. They lowered it in this last report versus December and versus a year ago. It's a sharp decline in feed usage. The biggest decline, though, is in exports. And you'll see that exports, they took exports down versus December, another 150 million. on U.S. corn exports. And versus a year ago, the number is what, 546, David, I
You got it.
believe?
546, you're right. Yes.
546 million bushels below last year on corn exports. And, you know, what's that all about? Like I said, it's a lot of things. But we've got more competition that's come in from Brazil. And we know that Ukraine is a corn exporter, and that's down. So why are our corn exports down that much? Well, frankly, it's again, it's high prices are cutting back demand, but we're also getting more competition from Brazil on corn exports, and their crop was apparently larger than we thought because they are continued to be throughout the entire fall into the early winter. They've had corn prices cheaper than the U.S., and so therefore the world has turned toward Brazil for its corn imports. So that's been a big portion of it right there. And there's more to that picture too than what I just said, and this is kind of something that is sort of a little bit stunning. But as we all know, China has become a bigger importer of corn in the past 2 years than they were prior to the past 2 years. Big soybean importer, of course, but not corn so much. In fact, going prior to 2 years ago, China had never imported more than 7 million tons of corn from all origins.
They did 3 times that much just with us.
Yes, they did 3 times that much just with us 2 years ago. This past year, they continue to buy corn out of the U.S., not as much as the previous year. But here's something that's kind of interesting and shocking. As you know, Brazil is becoming a major producer and exporter of corn. But this past November 22nd, as a matter of fact, a deal was cut between China and Brazil that regarding sanitary and phytosanitary requirements. China, prior to this past November 22nd, could not import corn from Brazil because it did not meet their phytosanitary requirements. A deal was cut, now they can. And the very first vessel out of Brazil to ship corn to China was shipped this past December. I don't remember the exact date, but it was right around the 20th or 22nd, somewhere in there.
Toward the end of the month, yes, definitely.
Yeah, the very first vessel. So what does this mean? This means that Brazil, as you can see, has got a big corn crop coming on. So therefore, the rest of this year, the rest of the crop year into the following year, there's going to be more Brazilian corn going to China in the past. And so that's going to cut back U.S. corn demand, plain and simple. World demand, no. That all shifts around. That won't affect world demand very much at all, but it will hurt U.S. corn exports, and that's why the USDA continues to cut corn exports, is because they're sitting there looking at the numbers saying we're going to lose even more business. And in fact, this coming year, the projection, if we look at the past 23 years, this year's corn exports out of the U.S. are projected to be the 8th smallest in the past 23 years.
Wow.
Now, just a year ago, we had the all-time record for corn exports.
John, couple of things to maybe add in there. It was 3 years ago, I believe, that they realized that their stocks of corn had gone way out of condition. They dumped them all and then replaced a bunch of it. That's kind of a once every 3 to 5 year thing with them. Did that impact any of this in the last
couple
of years, big time?
That caused a big surge in demand that occurred 2 years ago. And, of course, once they got those reserves built back up again, then their demand for corn tailed off. But their overall demand for corn imports is much greater than it was prior to 3 years ago or 2 years ago. Like I said, they'd never imported more than 7 million tons. 2 years ago, they imported 24 million tons approximately, and this past year it was in the vicinity of 20 to 21 million tons of corn, and this coming year it's projected to be at least 18 million. It may go even higher than that. But less of that's going to come out of the U.S. than it has in the past 2 years because of this deal cut with Brazil. But the corn that's coming out of Brazil, of course, it was going elsewhere. Some of that will come back to the U.S.
John, talk now as well. When we talk about supply and demand, we have to talk about ethanol. And that's kind of a whole new animal, particularly, I think, with the amount of export of ethanol that just seems to continue to creep up and up and up.
Yeah, the ethanol situation is flattened out, as you well know. And in fact, the USDA is projecting that less corn will be used for ethanol this year versus last year, and I'm talking crop years. And you can see the numbers up there. But I think it's 51 million of corn usage to go down this year versus last year. And that market is flattened out, and it's unlikely to grow much, if any more. Highly unlikely that it's going to grow because of all the various factors, electric vehicles being one of them. And David, do you want to comment further about that?
Yeah.
Well, that's on a domestic level, but
Right.
Again, I continue to hear stories about these other countries who are looking to expand their importation of some of our ethanol.
Correct, yes, because Brazil has been the leader in ethanol, and they haven't exported any of it because they use it there. Plus, they use sugarcane to make it because it's more efficient than corn. But China has been demanding more ethanol because, as you pointed out recently, they're importing crude oil from Russia. They're importing crude oil from Russia. So they need ethanol to add there for the blend for their cars to run appropriately. So that's causing bigger demand for ethanol here. So, and especially with Argentina now, with their poor corn crop, they're going to have to buy ethanol from us to make it their own needs up. So yeah, there's some ethanol stories out there that I think are going to see better demand, yes.
Yeah, not that it's going to really move the needle a whole lot.
I'll take the other side of that one. Sorry, guys.
Go for it.
But the greatest, our ethanol that's exported is only about 7% of our total production, if that. Okay, exports are going to grow. It's just not going to grow enough because domestic demand is going to get even less.
Well, that's what I was going to say. The latest news story out of Canada is that they're going to begin to import more of our ethanol. But to your point, I think that's kind of a creep instead of a surge.
It's a creep. You see the USDA, they've cut that ethanol demand back, and they look at this coming year to be less than it was last year. And there's other factors involved there, but the growth market for ethanol, corn for ethanol use, is pretty much flattened out. It's pretty much done.
But we do have E15 coming, John, and that is going to be it. No, it's not going to be.
No, it's
is it?
here.
No.
E15 is here. Won't argue that. The problem is getting the pumps to.
I know. How many pumps are in Fort Wayne with E15? I think, Landmark has it on the south side of town, and there's one on the north side there off of Maple Crest.
Right.
That station has
BP,
it.
yeah.
Station.
So that's the only ones I know of.
Yeah. Now, talk about wheat real quickly.
Let me add one thing in there, though. Okay, the problem with moving the E15 is the fact that we don't have the pumps. The gasoline stations don't have the pumps to do it. Okay?
Well, and here's the deal.
And it's expensive. They don't want to spend the money.
And the ethanol people have gone after the government to try and help with that. Here's a number that I know it sounds like a big number, but it's not when you consider it's the entire country. There are 2,600 ethanol pumps in service right now. 2,600. It's probably a tenth of that here in Fort Wayne.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Pumping stations.
Yes.
Most of them are, of course, in the corn states. Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota is where most of them are, naturally. But you brought up what I was going to say, Rob, is that the gasoline stations, they have to spend the money to put in the ethanol pumps. It's too expensive to do it. If they build a new station, they might put them in, but they're not going to replace the existing ones. But there is a movement undergoing right now in Congress for government subsidies to come in to get the gas stations to put in the pumps.
Yeah,
If that happens, that will change things.
Yeah,
Rob
we'll see
asked
how
me
that
to
shakes out.
talk about wheat. I'd like to very quickly. We are looking at $9.10 a bushel. They are saying that's up $1.47 from a year ago. Here's the reason why. This is the tightest stocks to usage ratio on wheat. What is the stocks to usage ratio? What are we talking about? It's how much is left vis-a-vis what the demand for it is. And typically, you get a very, very high stocks to usage ratio on wheat. It's like 20%, it's 30%, but to be down to only 7.1% means there's been a tremendous lowering of stocks for the wheat market, and I believe that we could look at a $10 wheat market again, especially here in the United States, since we've had a few problems with it. If they don't get it planted in South Dakota, North Dakota, I think that's going to be a big issue too. So keep an eye on the weather here very, very closely, because the heat we're seeing in the South is going to stay, and we're going to be getting colder here, as I mentioned in the preview that you guys got, because of the polar vortex. Yes, it's here. The first time in 2 years. The polar vortex hit last week on Thursday. So cold is coming.
Careful. Ryan Martin just walked in the building.
I was going to say, I want to hear what Ryan.
That's okay.
Sorry, David. I want to hear what Ryan has to say about that.
We'll let him beat you up in just a second. But you made the point about wheat and the weather, and obviously those states in the United States that are the big wheat growers are the ones that have had the biggest issues with drought. But you're also talking about other countries around the world.
Yes.
So from a global standpoint, you were talking recently about Australia, New Zealand.
Right. They're all growing. They're growing as much wheat as they possibly can. How much can they offset Ukraine and Russia? Russia recently had 5 to 10 degrees below zero in their wheat areas with no snow cover, so that's no fun. Last thing, and this is my own thing. Oh, yes, we're running out of time, sir.
I thought the last word was yours.
You got, okay.
It is.
Excuse me. I'm very sorry.
You owe me an apology.
You've got the last word. I agree. Okay. National corn value, national soybean value, national wheat value. How much is it worth nationally? What did ethanol do to corn? Okay. What did it do to corn? Do you know that ethanol, before we had that in the mix, it was like $25 to $30 billion nationally in 2005? What is it now? $91.992 billion. Yes, I know, Bob, I know. You know what I know. Okay, it's easy to get. And if you have a hard time finding it on the internet, how much is our crop worth nationally? I've looked and looked and looked, so I do it myself, all right? Simple. You take the crop production number, and you take the average price from the supply and demand. They're right there, and multiply them together, okay? So you get $91.992 billion worth of corn. Wow. I feel the way that the market looks, John and Rob and Gene, I feel it's going to go to $95 billion. What is that? It's exactly $7 on the average price. Now, on the wheat, $15.002 billion. Normally it's $9 to $10 billion. We don't see the wheat value that high, but it is now. It's very, very high. That's taking the production of 1.651 times 910. And soybeans, 4.276 versus 1420, $60.2 billion. Now, normally the beans were 35 to 40 billion. When China started buying a bunch of beans, it went to 42 billion. Look where we are now, 60.2 billion. To me, that's a huge, huge number, but I expected, Bob, to go to 65. It's too cheap, because a couple years ago we hit 62. I want to see it hit a record. So that would take us to $15 a bushel, all right? And see, these numbers are so flexible. I can do whatever I want with them. Let's say, I know what the price in Chicago is. Drive it into the national value, and you'll tell you how big the crop is. Just a little math, a little wink, 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 like this. And wow, it's so easy to do. You can do it on the calculator. You don't have to go to some university to tell you what the crop is worth. You don't have to go to somebody and ask them what the national average of cash value is. You will know it. It's a very simple formula. It's something anybody can do. If somebody asks you sometime, well, what do you think the bean crop's going to do? Plug in the numbers of what Chicago's worth, plug it in, divide it into the total value. It gives you the size of the crop. And if it's higher than what they're predicting, oops, the price is too high. Huh? Wait a minute. You can tell when the price is too high basis this? Yes, you can. And when the price is where it is and the value is lower, you can say, wait a minute, it's too cheap. It's too cheap. I can tell from what Yo-Yo said over at the farm. Excuse me, the dumb one. Okay, if you can't get you to laugh, I'll do anything I can. Right, Gene? So I want to measure this. I want to continue to measure it, and you can do it too. The last word.
Whew, holy cow.
You got the last word, Kevin.
All right, the last word is, and we'll try to make this as quick as possible, of course, but we've thrown a whole lot of numbers out there to you that can be very, very confusing. But I'll say I'm going to boil it down to the simplest way to do it. All you got to really pay attention to are what the projected ending stocks are, and what that is a percentage of the total supply of grain. Yes. because that tells you whether grain is in more than adequate supply, or whether it's very tight, meaning low prices, so-so prices, or very high prices. And watch that number and learn those ratios, and you don't need to pay any attention to anything else. That tells the story. The story that we're presenting today is that stocks are tight for corn and soybeans, and that is somewhat bullish. Now, let's take a look at that. Bullish. Everything we've given you today is primarily bullish, but however, we've already at these prices on corn, and soybeans actually look a little low. I can build a case for soybeans going higher because of the ratio. You know, you get that $14 price and $7 corn, you're only at a 2.0 ratio. It can go higher than that and still get the job done. And so upper prices in corn will tend to bring soybean prices a little higher. However, what is the flaw in all of this? What is the other side of this bullish story? Because you always got to show the other side of the coin. And it's very, very simple. Number one, we've talked about South America. All right, two things. Argentina, drought, small crops. Brazil, huge crops. Huge crops. If you take corn, soybean production, current projections for all of South America, it projects 10 million tons more grain than a year ago. That's bearish. That's not bullish. That's actually quite bearish. And the other thing is, we got a yield, we upped the yield to 173.3. You know, that's still below trend line because of the drought in the central part of the U.S. We could easily have good weather next year. Things could turn around because normally we have good weather more often than we have bad weather. And the trend line yield on corn is around 176. If we just go to trend line or above it, we add a lot of corn to the marketplace. Suddenly, we go from tight supplies to adequate supplies, and that's bearish. So there are as many things out there that are bearish, maybe more things that are bearish than currently bullish. That's it. I'm done.
Great.
Questions, please. Yes, sir. Yes. I'm in a Buffalo market. I can't sense any bullish feelings because I'm worried about demand dropping. I got to give it some more time. Oh, one more hint, you guys. Look at the high and low in January. You set the basis. Remember W.D. Gann in the class? You set the basis for the whole year. If you take out the January low, it won't come back to July. If you take out the January high, let it go. So watch the high and low in January.
That's an awfully good question because we've given you both sides of the coin, and we never really gave a conclusion because we don't know. We don't really know what's going to happen. But I will say, the more I look at it, the more I think about it, we've got some extremely high prices now. They're not likely to go any higher unless we have a spring, summer weather pattern. Plain and simple.
Yes.
And with the right things happening, like, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war, if things, that starts showing an end, that's going to be very bearish.
Yes.
I am actually today, I see all the bullish factors, no question about it, but it's going to take bad weather to get it going any higher.
Right.
I'm more concerned about the downside than I am the upside at the moment because prices are extraordinarily high and profitable. Don't let them get away from you.
I'm not excited about the higher prices. I'm worried about lower prices, Rob.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if you're just looking at this thing myopically and you're just looking at supply and demand issues, then you're thinking, okay, it's pretty bullish. But then you add in all of these potential things that we're not sure about just yet. That's where the bearish part of it comes in. But at these prices, it's hard to justify leaving too much of it still in the bin.
Yeah, there's quite a bit still in the bins.
Yes.
I've heard as much as 40% of the crop, but that sounds awfully high to me. Now, new crop seems undervalued. It seems like it's too big of a discount.
It is.
But while you're waiting for it to go higher, you could miss the whole boat.
The D's corn and no beans, yes. We had another question here. Yes, sir.
They kicked the can down the road, but non-GMO corn to Mexico. Is that a non-event?
John.
No, it's very political, of course, and the U.S. has taken a strong stance against that, and for the moment, Mexico is back down. Okay, they've said that they're going to back away from the refusing to buy U.S. corn. However, I'm not the least bit concerned about it because if we look down the road, first of all, the amount of corn they use that has to be non-GMO is only for domestic consumption, for food, and only 7% of their whole corn usage is for that. The rest is for animal feed, so it's no big deal.
Right.
The other thing, it's no big deal at all. The other thing is, if there's a market out there for non-GMO corn, the U.S. is going to produce it. They'll just contract grow it because we're the closest source and the largest source of corn. It's not going to get away from us. In my opinion, it's a non-issue.
Yeah. Any more questions? That was good. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes,
Where's Europe? I mean, we've heard all about the hunger stones because
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Not so much corn. They don't grow much corn. In Germany, they only grow it for silage, but it doesn't have long enough growing season, because if you look where they are, look where London is, it's up in Canada on the same area, so they don't have that much weather. They had a terrible wheat crop in France, England, and Germany. They've had some problems with some of the eastern areas. On bad weather, they had drought there. A lot of issues came up in Eastern Europe because they were worried about Ukraine. They've been taking grain from Ukraine and then exporting it out. So there's some surplus, like Romania, Bulgaria have a little surplus right now. But other areas have a big shortfall in Europe. Very good question, because we've been seeing consistently the Netherlands and Germany and Spain have all been buying soybeans, and they never used to. So that's a good sign to see. Yes. Any more questions? Very, very good. Yes, sir. Way back there. Mississippi.
Oh, yes, it is getting better.
Yes.
Yes. However, if we continue to see basically dry weather, it will become an issue again.
Yes.
But we did get enough rain during the fall to take the pressure off the Mississippi, but it's still a very big concern.
Anyone else? Please. these are
And
great.
one added note to that, I think the rail strike, or the potential of it, or the potential of any kind of a slowdown in rail is equally as problematic as is the Mississippi River going dry.
Good point. Yes. Anyone else, please? Yes, Bob.
With all the rain in the west, California, Oregon, how's that going to affect the western states and the drought issue?
I was surprised both Oregon and Washington cut back their white wheat crop, their winter white wheat crop. I was really surprised at that. They'll probably try and push a little more spring wheat, but it works better in Oregon than Washington. They can't plant it early enough. But that really surprised me, so keep an eye on that.
Yeah, but
too.
this thing about you're asking about giving significant drought relief. Okay. Yeah, what I've heard is you need about 7 years of the amount of rain they got this past year to offset the drought.
I agree.
Well, there's another part of that. My son is a firefighter in Southern California, and he has told me recently about the idiocy of their governor in that state. Big surprise, right? Who let a gob of water out last spring. I mean, they have no idea how to control the water there. But John makes a good point, which is also applicable to something that had happened in Argentina that we also saw a little bit of in the Dakotas this past year. When you get profoundly dry, it takes that first deluge of water just pretty much rolls off and it goes to nowhere. And Argentina just recently was talking about, well, the stuff that did come in, and we get these headlines. Oh, hey, it rained in Argentina. And everybody, and all the guys in the market, the traders, boom, it spikes, because of the headline. But then you talk to the guys on the ground and you go, it was nowhere near enough to replenish the soil content. It just, it just went away. It's one of the things that happened out west from the Pacific Northwest myself. One of the things that happened in Argentina and certainly happened in the upper Midwest last year. That's all the time that we've got for the guys. Thanks so much
Thank
for
you.
listening. And continue to
Yes,
listen
thank
to
you.
Midwest Ag Matters. We'll tell you where you can find the video if you want to go back and watch it again.